Throughout history, with the advancement of weapons technology, from catapults to cannons to unmanned aerial combat vehicles, there has long been a belief that the infantryman would be rendered obsolete in the face of these new and lethal developments. And yet, time and time again, the infantryman has perished as the drive to develop new weapons has also continually afforded him the capabilities to remain relevant, even on the high-tech 21st century battlefield. In every conflict, there has been weapons that have changed the way the infantry meets the enemy, and World War II saw one of the most notable in this regard, the US M1 Garand. The M1 has largely come to symbolize America's war on the ground, from its classic lines, top-loading ammunition, and its distinctive ping sound as it ejects its spent clip. The M1 is as ingrained in the minds of Americans as the image of the muskets of the Revolutionary War or the M16 of the Vietnam War. However, what made the M1 such a powerful and timeless weapon was its high rate of fire over similar weapons fielded by other armies of its day. For the M1 was the world's first semi-automatic battle rifle to see widespread adoption, giving the US infantryman a considerably higher rate of fire and providing the genesis for the modern weapons of today. In this episode, we are going to explore the development of this revolutionary weapon, examine its role in the Second World War and beyond, and discuss its legacy. Welcome to Wars of the World. Our videos span events across the world, talking about far-off places which you might never have heard of. We're always interested in learning more about how our world works, because understanding the world's geography can help explain why geopolitical tensions arise. And that's why we're genuinely excited to share today's sponsor with you, MOVA Globes. MOVA Globes are innovative rotating globes which are completely powered by light. The cutting-edge technology allows the globe to spin by itself when exposed to ambient light, so there's no need for cords or batteries. We have the stunning 6-inch world map globe in blue, but the globes come in a range of designs, including world maps, famous artworks, and outer space. All the globes in the outer space collection feature graphics from NASA and include constellations, planets, and more. MOVA Globes want to bring a bit of the beautiful back into the everyday, and so we're happy to say that you can get 10% off both the 6-inch and 8.5-inch MOVA Globes when you use our code WOTW at checkout. Or you can use the link in our description to get your very own spinning masterpiece at home. The story of this legendary rifle starts not in the United States, but over the northern border in Quebec, Canada, for this was the birthplace of one John Cantius Garand on January 1st, 1888. Not long after, the young Garand soon found himself working in several textiles mills and factories where he plied his trade as a machinist. Eventually he found his way to Rhode Island working in a tool factory, and this experience would eventually trigger the ambitious young man's imagination as he was soon pondering new ways of making machines work. With the outbreak of the Great War, like many would-be inventors, he soon began pondering new weapons for the battlefield and developed a design for a lightweight, fully automatic machine rifle. While the weapon was rejected by the US military for full production, the innovative design brought him to the attention of the US authorities, and before long, he was offered a government position within the National Bureau of Standards, the US governing body responsible for maintaining a universal measurement system within the United States, before he was eventually transferred to the Springfield Armory. It was here that he became involved in a new project which aimed to increase the rate of fire available to the standard infantryman. This was by no means a new concept, and had been the goal of weaponsmiths since 1836, when gunsmith Johann Nicolas von Drais produced a new rifle intended for the use by the Prussian army that would radically change infantry weapon design for the next 100 years. Known as the Dreiss needle gun, it outwardly resembled earlier muzzle-loading rifles, being the norm amongst most armies at the time, but differed in that it used a bolt, handled by the operator to load a new round into the breech at the rear of the barrel, and additionally ejected a spent cartridge after firing. Compared to the older muzzle-loading weapons, this bolt-action system allowed for a much higher rate of fire, in the region of 6 rounds a minute. Once the benefits of the bolt-action rifle were realized, every major power in the world soon began manufacturing their own, and the bolt-action rifle would dominate the battlefield well into the 20th century. Many of these weapons, such as the British Lee-Enfield 303, the American M1903 Springfield, the German Gewehr 98, and the Russian Mosin Nagant, each achieved near legendary status in their own right in their respective countries. However, after almost a century, there had been little improvement in the capability, and in particular the firing rate of these weapons, as they were restricted by how fast the soldier operating them could work the reloading mechanism. This became a serious hindrance in the Great War, as the machine gun became a major factor on the battlefield. Able to spray a hail of bullets over a large area, the machine gun was fortunately a heavy and complex weapon, which required a crew or a team to operate. But that was enough to inflict heavy casualties on troops still clutching their bolt-action rifles. The ultimate goal bestowed upon Garand and his peers was to develop an infantry weapon with a high enough rate of fire to give a soldier the ability to challenge a machine gun position, or to take on an enemy of superior numbers with confidence. By 1920, the race was very much on, and Garand was faced with stiff competition. Excluding foreign engineers working on their own designs for their respective governments, Garand had to contend with proposals put forward by respected US arms manufacturers, such as Browning and Colt, who were well known for their pistols and machine guns respectively, while sandwiched in between was Thompson, whose machine gun design would become a truly great weapon in both military and criminal history, it being known forever after as the Tommy gun. However, aside from competition being his biggest problem, Garand actually found that it was his main customer, the US military, who had proved the source of his biggest headache in developing a faster firing rifle. Throughout the 1920s, he found himself having to rework his design as the US Army changed their specifications on several occasions. The US military ended the Great War still equipped with the bolt-action M1903 Springfield and the M1917 Enfield, each chambered to fire the then standard 30-06 round, which equated to 7.62 x 63 mm. These weapons combined with this round meant that US troops were equipped with a powerful, accurate, and long-range weapon, whose only drawback was of course the typically low rate of fire. Speculating that such a powerful round might not be suitable for the expected generation of faster-firing rifles, the US military became interested in a new round with a 7mm diameter, dubbed the .276 and designated as the intermediate round. Garand continued working on a weapon for the older sized round until it became clear that production was not going to be authorized. Garand would revise his design several times into the late 1920s and into the 1930s, but continued focusing on the .30 round rather than the .276, believing that the US Congress would ultimately select this caliber. He would be proven right. In February 1932, despite the promise of the .276 round in terms of weight saving and performance, the Secretary of War ordered all work on self-reloading rifles chambered for the .276 round to stop. Instead, their work should focus on developing a production version of Garand's latest rifle, chambered with the standard .30 caliber round. The weapon went to field trials in May 1934 and was cleared for procurement on November 7, 1935. Within a year, the United States military became the first in the world to issue their troops with a semi-automatic battle rifle as their standard weapon, capable of firing over 40 rounds a minute. But just how did Garand achieve this? Technically, Garand didn't design just one semi-automatic rifle for the US, but two. The original service versions of what became designated as the M1 Garand rifle used a complicated gas system involving a special muzzle extension gas trap. However, this was later dropped in mid-1940, replaced instead by a simpler drilled gas port, this newer design then being retrofitted to the older rifles, so that one basic design was adopted across the entire US arsenal. In both systems, expanding gases from a fired cartridge are diverted into the gas cylinder. Here the gases meet a long stroke piston attached to the operating rod, which is pushed rearward by the force of this high pressure gas. Then the operating rod engages a rotating bolt inside the receiver. The bolt is locked into the receiver via two locking lugs, which rotate, unlock, and initiate the ejection of the spent cartridge and the reloading cycle when the rifle is discharged. The operating rod and subsequently the bolt then returns to its original position. Weighing in at 11.6 pounds or 5.3 kilograms when loaded, the M1 Garand is a bit of a brute, especially compared to modern day standards. However, it was still on par with the previous generation of rifles, making Garand's design all the more impressive when you consider that he was able to improve performance without increasing weight, which would have added to the burden on the soldier. Neither was it considerably larger than the previous weapons, measuring 53.5 inches or 110 centimeters long. In fact, it was 8 centimeters shorter than the preceding M1917 Enfield. Perhaps the most distinctive part of the M1 is its 8-round on-block clip. This makes the M1 one of the exceptions to the other rifles at the time, or in the decades which would follow, as most weapon manufacturers attempting to produce their own semi-automatic rifles chose to use a boxed magazine in which the rounds would be stored prior to loading into the rifle proper, ready for firing. Garand's decision to adopt such a design stems from the US military, who specified during the development phase that box magazine designs should be avoided if possible, as it was believed that such magazines were prone to damage or an influx of dirt, which could result in a stoppage at a crucial time during a battle, and also made handling them when in a prone position more awkward. The clip design was often more time consuming to assemble, but fortunately, the mighty American logistics chain meant that there was usually an abundance of preloaded clips readily available to the frontline troops. When the last round was fired and the clip ejected from the rifle, it was accompanied by a highly distinctive ping sound, which has since become one of the most recognizable sounds of the war. However, this sound also led to claims that some US troops were killed because their enemy knew that they had expended their last round of ammunition upon hearing the sound of the M1's clips being ejected. However, there are no documented cases of any American or Allied soldiers fielding the weapon being killed or wounded under such circumstances. Since troops rarely fought alone, it meant that there was high chances that someone in the platoon was ready to fire while a soldier needed to reload. On top of this, the battlefield was hardly a quiet enough place to even hear the ping from any distance. It seemed more likely that this was a concern conjured up away from where the actual fighting was taking place. Completing the M1 package was an attachment meant as a last resort: the fixed bayonet. It was standard practice for a battle rifle to have fixtures for a bayonet, for when the fighting became so close you could spit on your enemy. In these instances, the rifle with a bayonet became more akin to a battle lance. Early M1s were often fitted with the M1905 bayonet, developed for the previous generation of rifles, this having a 16-inch or 51-centimeter blade. However, after the Second World War broke out, it was felt that this was too large for the type of fighting that was taking place, particularly in the narrow confines of the jungle warfare of the Pacific Theater. And so a shortened version, being 10 inches or 25 centimeters long, was produced. Many of the earlier blades being cut down to the new size in order to speed up deliveries to the frontline units. In 1939, as war in Europe looked increasingly likely, the British government requested an inspection of the M1 Garand for possible licensed production and use by both British and Commonwealth forces. Although impressed, the British ultimately settled on standardizing the Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark I rifle, as it would be easier to produce, being an improvement on the tried and tested Lee Enfield series of bolt-action weapons. By the time the United States entered the war, the M1 was well on its way to dominating the US infantry, and many of its little kinks had been worked out. Yet even so, by the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, many of the older bolt-action rifles were still in widespread service. As destruction rained down from the Japanese planes, US service personnel raided their weapon lockers for anything to fire at their attackers. And this included an estimated 15,000 M1 Garands used among the forces stationed on Hawaii on that otherwise mild December morning. The next day came the real test for the rifle, as the Japanese landed in force in the Philippines. Here the weapon appeared to impress everyone, and not just their American operators, for as one Japanese report put it, describing the combat with American troops, quote, "How has the US managed to equip every infantryman with a machine gun?" End quote. In fact, the Japanese would be so impressed with the M1 Garand that they began studying captured examples in the hope of first producing their own and then improving on the design. The result was the Japanese Type 4 rifle, which used much of the inner workings of the M1, but dispensed with the on-block clip in favor of an integral 10-round magazine chambered for the standard Japanese 7.7 by 58mm Arisaka cartridge. Compared to its US forebear, the Type 4 was roughly similar in dimensions, but had marginally reduced range. Fortunately for the Allies, the Japanese were only able to manufacture around 250 of the weapons before the war ended, and thus they were little more than a footnote in Japan's war history. Ironically, however, surplus M1 Garands would help establish the Japanese self-defense forces after the war. The M1's combat debut in Europe came on August 19, 1942, during the ill-fated Dieppe raid. Aimed at appeasing Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's demands for a second front in Europe, now that the US were in the war, the Dieppe raid was a largely Canadian affair, but featured some 50 US Army Rangers, many of whom were equipped with the M1s. The raid was ultimately a disaster, although the US troops were noted as having acquitted themselves with their semi-automatic rifles during the fight. The surge in US military numbers in 1942 had affected the complete withdrawal of the older generation of rifles, as there simply wasn't enough M1 Garands to go around, even with the retooling of the US industrial complex towards weapons of war. Many US units were still fielding the M1903s well into 1944, and it was not uncommon for fire teams to be created operating of a mix of the old bolt-action rifles with the newer semi-automatic Garands. This was not helped by the fact that Allied nations also began demanding the newer weapon, particularly as Germany began producing weapons such as the STG-44, the world's first true assault rifle. As a result, frontline units naturally took priority when it came to shipments of new build weapons, while secondary units, such as military police and engineers, had to soldier on with their venerable World War I era weapons. While a generally well-liked weapon, the M1 did have one rather painful vice that caught out more than a few unsuspecting GIs, who would suffer an injury which would become known as M1 thumb. This injury occurred as a result of the bolt closing at incredible speed and smashing the user's thumb into the receiver, resulting in a rather nasty crescent-shaped blood blister beneath the user's thumbnail, which itself could be left cracked or scratched. As the war dragged on, there were calls for shortened versions of the M1 Garand, especially from tank crews who wanted to carry them inside their vehicles for fending off infantry or fighting to escape a disabled tank. Shortened M1s were also seen as desirable for use in the dense jungle combat of the island hopping campaign in the Pacific or in Asia. Two variations were created in an effort to meet this need: the M1E5, an 18-inch or 45.72cm barrel and a metal folding buttstock. With this as well as the T26, which featured an 18-inch barrel but with the standard wood stock. While the T26 proceeded as far as to undertake combat trials in the Philippines in 1945, neither of them was formally adopted, although post-war a number of standard M1s had been modified to this standard, both for civilian and some unofficial clients. Given its accuracy and stopping power, the M1 Garand was inevitably employed as a sniper rifle. Designated the M1C by the US Army and later as the MC-52 by the US Marine Corps, the availability of the earlier generation of rifles for the role meant that the sniper variant of Garand rifles only saw limited use prior to 1945. However, it would establish itself well into the post-war period and would still be fielded by some Marine sniper teams in the first half of the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s. Development of the sniper variant was hindered by the top-loading nature of the rifle, which would be impossible with a sniper scope blocking this location. In the end, it was determined that the best solution would be to mount the telescope on the left side of the receiver, so that normal functioning of the rifle would be unaffected. This required a leather cheek pad to be added to the stock, in order to properly position the shooter's face when aiming. However, This was not viewed as a serious detriment to a well-trained and experienced operator, as most snipers were by the time they entered the battlefield. The scope initially chosen for the rifle was Lyman Company's M81, based on the commercial Alaskan all-weather hunting scope. This came with a 2.2 magnification and had a crosshair reticule, but it was soon superseded by the improved M82. Beginning in January 1945, the sniper variant also began featuring a distinct conical flash hider, both to reduce the chances of the sniper being detected at the point of firing, and to reduce the blinding effect of the muzzle flash during low-light engagements. Production of the M1 Garand did not end with victory over the Axis powers, and continued on until the last examples were assembled at the Springfield Armory in early 1957. More than 5.4 million M1 rifles were made, and furthermore, it went on to influence a number of weapons which followed. Recognizing that battlefield rifles were advancing once again, with the introduction of assault rifles, like the early Soviet AK-47 and the European equivalent in the shape of the superb Belgian FN FAL, work was undertaken on improving the M1, and this led to the M14. The M14 rifle was basically an improved M1 Garand, with selective automatic and semi-automatic modes, and utilizing a 20-round box magazine. Ammunition-wise, it was chambered for the 7.62 by 51mm round, which NATO armies were then standardizing on. In Italy, the Italian manufacturer Beretta acquired the tooling to build M1s from the Winchester Company, who had been drafted in to help with the wartime production. Beretta also began work on their own improvement to the basic M1, resulting in the BM59 rifle, which shares a strong similarity to the M14. As the original M1 Garands were phased out of frontline US service, hundreds of thousands of them were filtered down to armies being aided by the United States, particularly in the fight against the post-war spread of communism, directed by the Soviet Union. Almost every major conflict in the 2 decades after World War II featured M1s and their derivatives in some form or another. In fact, despite examples now being over 70 years old, M1s have continued to see combat in third world countries, including by insurgent groups acting against the United States during conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. It is little wonder, therefore, that after World War II, General George S. Patton felt confident enough to remark that the M1 Garand was, in his opinion, quote, "the greatest battle implement ever devised."